Okay, so a very warm welcome to all of you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. For me, it's 10 p.m. at Melbourne time. But it's an event and a session that I cannot miss. I know Mel very well, and it would be such a pity if looking just at the time and I were to miss this event. And a very warm welcome to all of you. And also we have Bat Holmes and also Wendy Conrad joining me as the RIG convener for the inclusive leadership. So it's a rejuvenated RIG, and we have rebranded it, and you play a very important role as being members of our RIG and being part of the first event that we are doing it together. So we have a very special speaker here with us. We have Professor Mel Ainscow, and Professor Mel Ainscow is very well known, and he's emeritus professor at the University of Manchester. Also, he has affiliation with the University of Glasgow and also an adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology. And Professor Ensko has been, a long-term consultant to UNESCO, and he's really very much internationally recognized. And I would say an authoritarian in anything that is related to inclusive education, inclusive schools. And I particularly enjoy the latest book that Mel has published in 2024, and that's by Routledge, that is on developing inclusive schools pathway to success. And we are very honored and we are happy to have Mel to start off that RIG session for us. And so let's give a very warm welcome to Mel.
Okay, well, thank you, Donny, and it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm speaking to you from the centre of the world. That is the city of Manchester here in the United Kingdom. Those of you who know Manchester will know that it has a fantastic reputation for rain. But actually, I can tell you today it's a completely blue sky. And when this meeting is over, I'm going to go and sit in the yard and read my book in the sunshine. So it's great pleasure to be with you all, and particularly at the start of this important new network that Belmas is creating. And it clearly is already a very international network, as we see from the list of people who are joining us today. What I want to do in relation to the title is to reflect on my experiences. As Donny says, I've been fortunate in my life in a number of ways professionally, one of which that I've been associated with UNESCO for something like 30 years, which is the main United Nations organization concerned with education. And as a result of that, I've been able to have the privilege of working with schools and teachers and sometimes education systems around the world. So what I want to do in this presentation is to reflect on my experiences. Really, I'm going to tell you stories. And from these stories, I hope it'll make you think about your story. Please be aware, I'm not coming with the answer. I've not got a sort of toolkit that you can take away and introduce tomorrow. Rather, I'm reflecting on experiences, drawing some ideas, and continuing on my journey of thinking about what can we do to develop more inclusive education systems, and of course, what are the implications for those people who are in leadership positions. So I'm going to think about these two questions. How can schools become more inclusive? And what are the implications for leadership and leadership practices? I picked up that phrase some years ago from a North American academic whose name I can't remember, but I like the phrase because it indicates that it's not leaders as kind of major figures, you know, thinking about the current North America, United States president, for example. We're talking about the practices of leadership, which, of course, in successful organizations are distributed, as we know. So I'm thinking about that as well. So let's start with the international context. Since 1990, the United Nations organizations have led a policy move called Education for All. It was launched in 1980 at a major conference in Jomtien in Thailand, where they brought together ministers, prime ministers, and so on, and organizations around the world to address what was then seen as the major challenge as far as education was concerned globally. And the major challenge was that there were still, despite all the efforts that had gone on previously, there were still millions of children who literally never went into a school, not meet a teacher, because where they lived, there was no teacher and there was no school. The current estimate, that was in 1990 when that policy was launched. The current estimate, all these years later, is that currently 260 million children, 260 million children around the world do not go to school because there is not a school where they live. And I mean, it's a staggering figure that is still the case after all the kind of emphasis that's been placed on governments and trying to get them to invest in education. And of course, then there's another figure that we don't have, and that is about the numbers of children who do go to school and fail and stop going to school, or as it happens sadly in my country, are excluded from school at some time. So we have no idea how many children are failed globally by the education system. This photograph was taken some years ago in a city in India, and these children were some of the 260 million who receive no education. They live on a large, what we would call a shanty town, a town made up of homemade houses, very simple, very primitive, shared facilities and so on. And of course, there was no school where they lived. What happened was a committee of parents was formed, or to be more accurate, a committee of mothers was formed. And I think that might be significant. A committee of mothers were formed, and in a sense, they believed in the idea of education for all, and they wanted their children to have education. They had the help of a local charity. They collected some money, not very much. They got together some materials, and they built a classroom. And the object you can see at the back of the picture is the classroom that they built. Once there was a classroom, then, of course, the children could go to school for the first time. And in the picture, you can see these young children going to school for the first time. Some of them are smiling and happy. Some of them are not sure. They look uncertain. Some of them look quite worried and scared even. And of course, that happens on the first day of every school around the world. So there's nothing different about this. Standing in the shadows are two women. One of the women is the chair of the committee that built the classroom. The other woman is a teacher, because what happened was, once there was a classroom, the local government provided a teacher. Now, I tell this story for two reasons, which is linked to my theme. The first reason is to remind people like me, and many of you, that we live in countries which are the richest end of the education market as far as the world is concerned. The buildings, the resources, the human resources that we have in many of our countries are beyond the imagination of the majority world. So we have to remind ourselves how fortunate we are. And of course, what comes with that is a moral duty. It's a duty to make sure we're making use of those resources. And what I'm going to talk about is very much about making use of resources, particularly human resources. But the other reason to tell the story, even more important, is what lesson we can take from this group of mothers in this city in India. They believed in education for all. They had a collective will to make it happen, and together they made it happen. Now, in a sense, that's my key message here today in our discussion. What we're talking about is bringing people together, creating a collective will that all children will get an effective education and making it happen. And in a sense, those who are in senior positions, managers, leaders, whatever you choose to call yourself, seems to me that is your key role, to coordinate the action of people. So moving forward, I hope, yeah. I want to say, first of all, a little bit about the notion of being inclusive. You're probably aware that Sustainable Development Goal 4, which was introduced in 2016, very much talks about the importance of inclusion and equity. And I quite like that phrase, really, because the notion of equity underlines the importance of fairness. It's not just including all children, it's making sure that all children are treated fairly. As our Australian friends would tell us, all children are getting a fair go. So that's what it's about for me. So I think what we have to do is to be clear what we mean when we're saying being more inclusive. And I've characterized this as involving an inclusive turn. It's moving in a different direction if we're to make progress in relation to this agenda. So let me just define what I mean by an inclusive turn and encourage you to reflect on what you mean when you come along to a meeting like this to talk about leading inclusive schools. For me, inclusion is a process, not a state. It's a journey. The truth of the matter is there never will be an inclusive school. It's impossible. There'll always be new children who come along that require a school to think about what are we going to do now? What is the response we're going to make? So it's a never-ending journey. It is a process. Sometimes I work with very successful schools. I can think of one in this city, for example, that had made progress on this gender over 10 years or so. And I remember saying to some of the teachers, I'm bringing some visitors because you're an inclusive school. And one of the teachers said, don't call us that. We're not an inclusive school. We're committed to inclusion, but we're still moving forward on what I'm calling a journey or a process. For me, it's about identifying and removing barriers. Now, this is quite crucial to my thinking about all of this, and I invite you to think about your ideas. What do I mean by barriers? I mean contextual factors that limit children's educational progress. So what might they look like? Well, the curriculum can be a barrier if it's not designed with all children in mind. The assessment system can be a barrier if it doesn't celebrate the progress of all the children, some of whom may be making relatively slow progress. Of course, our teaching methods can be a barrier if we don't know how to design a lesson and manage a classroom where all children can feel that they can participate and gain from what's happening in the classroom. Some of the most difficult barriers, however, are the barriers in our minds. If we don't believe it's possible to include all children, then probably we won't be able to do it. But be clear, because this is fundamental to what I'm talking about. Contextual barriers. I'm not talking about barriers within children or barriers within families. That's the old thinking. It's sometimes called the medical model, the deficit model. The question that's implied is, what's wrong with the child? What can we do to fix the child? I'm taking a turn, remember. It's a kind of paradigm shift, if you will. And I'm saying we have to analyze the context. And there are many things that we do that create barriers, and we have to work together to address them. So for me, then, that inclusive turn involves three kind of stages. It's about the presence of students being there in the school, in the classroom. But for me, that's insufficient because you can be present and not gaining any benefit. So it's being present, but it's also participating, being in the classroom, being welcomed, having your name used, being invited to respond, all the subtle things that give messages to children within a normal lesson. But even that's insufficient because you can be present, you can be participating, and you may not be learning anything that's any use to you. So ultimately, the aim for me of inclusion is achievement, and it's about all students. So I'm reconstructing this agenda as being not instead of school improvement. This is school improvement, but it's school improvement with attitude. It's school improvement based on a set of principles which believes that every learner matters and matters equally. But of course, as professionals, we know that certain groups of children are likely to be at risk. So we have a moral duty to keep an eye on those students, and I'm not asking you not to do that. But then be careful too, because there may be some students who are not seen as being at risk, but are actually still marginalised within the schools. I'm talking about the students I sometimes meet in schools who tell me, and I'm thinking about secondary schools, that they go around the school all day going from lesson to lesson and no teacher seems to know their name. They're in school, they're attending, they're getting on with their learning. Are they included? Well, in one sense they are, but in a crucial sense, they don't feel included. So that's my definition as I move forward. I'm going to use a framework to think about what we need to do to move practice forward. Just to explain the origins of this framework, the work I say we do. I should explain I don't do anything on my own. I'm very committed to working in partnership with colleagues in universities, in schools, in local authorities, and so on. And what we normally do when we're working with networks of schools, as we do, is we invite schools to create some kind of inquiry team who will carry out investigations in their own school communities around that idea of barriers. And then we support them, observe what they're doing, try to make sense of what we're doing and draw the lessons. And of course, as academics in universities, our kind of accountability is to make sure we publish things. So that's the extra task that we take on. So we worked between 2006 and 2011 with all 16 secondary schools in one English local authority. It's a local authority which is characterised by a lot of fragmentation. Amongst the 16 schools, there are two selective schools, we call them grammar schools, where students take a test at 11. There are two faith schools run by church authorities, but they're state schools. And then the other schools are all what are sometimes called here comprehensive schools. So effectively, what's been created in that district, as is the case across England, I'm afraid, showing my prejudices, is a competition. It's a marketplace. And of course, parents fight to get their children in the best schools. So we worked with all 16 schools over 5 years. Now that's unusual. This kind of project that I'm talking about doesn't normally last 5 years because usually the money runs out. But we were fortunate in this situation in the schools funded themselves to be involved. We worked with the schools and they made various amounts of progress in relation to notions of inclusion and equity, some more and some effort, some less. And what we did at the end of the 5 years, of course, we wrote about it. And there is a book published in 2012 called Developing Equitable Education System that actually records the lessons we learned from these 16 schools. As we analysed our experiences in the schools, the degrees of progress varied, of course, but overall there clearly was evidence of progress, and that was reflected in examination results, in attendance, and in reports about improvements of behaviour. And so we tried to make sense of it in terms of the barriers, but also in terms of things that made a difference. And we came up with this simple typology, which we've subsequently used in quite a lot of other places and found it quite useful as a way of bringing people together. It's about what happens within schools, it's what happens between schools in a local area, and it's what happens beyond the school gate, talking about the families and the community, everybody else who gets involved in education. And our conclusion was that in relation to this particular context that I'm talking about, there were barriers within each of these three areas, but also there were resources, especially human resources, that could be mobilised to address those barriers. And I'm going to explain, using other examples as well, what I mean by the barriers and resources in this sense. My colleague Alan Dyson, who was a central part of this team, he came up with this phrase, the ecology of equity. That's what we were trying to use in this rather simple framework. So I'm going to use the three headings to talk about what I think I've learned about moving schools and systems forward, and then draw out some lessons for the notion of leadership. So first of all, within school factors. As part of my UNESCO work, I worked for some time in India. And this was a school I visited in the city of Delhi, New Delhi. And it's a government school that serves a very disadvantaged community. And when I first went to the school, I was really surprised. And I told the people in the school that how surprised I was because I expected there to be a fairly formal education system. Children sitting in rows, teachers doing much of the talking, children rather quiet. But in this particular school, I found something quite different. As I went from lesson to lesson, I saw lots of creative teaching, lots of interactive teaching, lots of cooperative teaching. In this classroom, for example, the children were doing a role play activity, and the role play was about a family and some problem that the family faced. So in each of the group, members of the family, the father, the mother, the grandparents, and so on, worked together to address the challenge that they were facing. It was a very noisy classroom. but it was a very inclusive classroom. Everybody was taking part. There was no question about it. At some point in the lesson, the teacher asked the children to sit down and be quiet, and then she asked them to tell the rest of their class what they had been learning. Now, one of the things I've learned from my experience, particularly in less well-off parts of the world, if you will, is how creative teachers develop ideas that work for them. That in the West, in Europe and the United States, we have lots of research about. And yet creative teachers probably don't know about that research, but in their efforts to be more inclusive and more equitable, they find ways forward. And clearly that's what had happened in this school. And I was amazed by it, really. And so I had the chance at the end of the day to meet with the teachers. And I said to them how surprised I was at what I'd seen. And I asked them, how was it that they'd come to use this very interactive, this very active learning in their classrooms? And they told me the story of how about a year previously, a new head teacher had been appointed. Rather respectfully, they talked about her as Madam. And they said that Madam had introduced some new policies in the school. And one of the policies that Madam had introduced was that once a month on a Saturday morning, and I'm not recommending this, but once a month on a Saturday morning, the teachers go back to the school and they take part in workshops. Now, I had the good fortune that during the week I was there was such a workshop and I was able to attend it. And at the workshop, I saw how Madam led the teachers in a discussion about teaching and learning and how they can make it more effective for all children. Around the school were all these wonderful posters that the teachers had developed on a Saturday morning, which summarised the learning they'd gone through. The two women in the second photograph, one woman is Madam in the red sari, and the other woman is a supporter from a local research institute who was working with them. Now, again, this was another example of the creativity of practitioners. Madam knew that she wanted to improve the learning of children, and she knew from her experience that the best way to do that is to invest in the learning of adults, of the teachers and the support staff. So she became the teacher of teachers, if you will, leading the staff in thinking about how their practice could improve. Now, again, those of you who know the formal research on educational leadership will know there's lots of research on this, that where there is professional development in the school, led by senior people, that will pay off in terms of the involvement of children and the learning of children. So she's providing a certain kind of leadership here. I asked the teachers about this and they said, but it's not just the workshops. We've learned something else. We've learned that if you want to try something new in your classroom, you need somebody else with you so that you feel supported. And they said, so sometimes what we do is we pair up and two of us will be in one classroom. We plan the lesson together and we teach together. And then afterwards we think about what we have learned. Now, again, we know from research that's the right thing to do. Kind of peer professional learning, if you will, that this head teacher had introduced into the school. But of course, I asked the obvious question, which some of you are probably thinking, is how do you do that? Especially, how do you find the time? So I said, how do you find the time? And they said, oh, it's difficult. I said, but sometimes Madam will take one of the classes to release the teacher to go and work with her partner. Again, leadership in action. Not just talking about improving practice, but getting out there and being involved in all of it. But they said, of course, that's not the answer because it's a big school and Madam is very busy. She can't be doing that all the time. So we've thought about other ways of making it happen, other ways of solving the problem. And they said, so one thing we do is sometimes we put two classes together so we can have that sort of team teaching. And I said, oh, how do you do that? I said, you've got 45 children in every class. The rooms are very crowded. And they said, oh, well, it is difficult, but what we do sometimes is we take the children outside. And again, I was lucky to see that. Now, you couldn't do this in February in Manchester because it would be pouring with rain. And that's not the point I'm making. I'm making the point about problem solving, collaborative, finding ways of solving the problem. So here, there's 90 or so children outside under the trees doing some group work with the two teachers planning and working together. You might notice something about the photograph, the groups, that I didn't notice till recently when I showed this picture somewhere. And of course, if you look, you see the groups seem to be either girls or boys. I didn't notice at the time, and I didn't ask whether that was the teacher's decision or whether the children's choice. I will never know, really. So what I'm arguing is that the development of inclusive schools requires the development of inclusive teaching. And what we have to think about is what are the ways of developing inclusive teaching, building on lessons like the school we've just visited in Delhi. Well, having worked with goodness knows how many schools, I am absolutely certain that always schools know more than they use. That is to say, that on any day, in any school, anywhere in the world, there is more knowledge, more expertise, more creativity lying latent than is being used. The logic of that, therefore, is the starting point for moving a school forward is not by looking outwards, well, I'm not opposed to that, it's by looking inwards. It's about finding the best practice that exists and moving knowledge around within a school. And schools that have made progress, like the one in Delhi, have an emphasis on moving knowledge around. And it has to be led. There's an obvious challenge which some of you are probably thinking about. I certainly get it raised whenever I talk to head teachers, as I did earlier this week in the Netherlands. Somebody will say, well, I agree with you, Mel. That's what we knew. But the problem is there isn't time. And I always say, well, then you don't agree with me. Time is the currency we use in schools to signal that something's important. There is no time. Everybody is very busy. But if you think something's important, you find time. And so I always say to head teachers, school directors, if, like me, you believe in the investment of adults as a means of improving the learning of children, you will find the time. There's no obvious answer, but it's back to that idea of problem solving, finding a way of solving that problem. But then there's another problem, which is related to time, and that is the nature of practice and how it develops within our profession of teachers. I still regard myself as a teacher because I worked in schools for a long time. I watch many lessons, and when I do, if I can, sit down with the teacher after the lesson and I have a chat. And I say, now look here, I'm not an inspector. This is not performance management. I'm trying to learn from you about your practice. And then I explain to them what I've seen and what I've heard in the previous 50 minutes or whatever it is. Now, when I do that, especially with very experienced teachers, they express surprise. They say, I don't remember doing that. Did I do that? And you see, that reminds somebody like me, who lives in the kind of twilight zone of the education system, how intensive the day of a teacher is. There is no time. You go into every lesson, you have your plan, but you know there are 30 other plans in the room. And if your plan doesn't fit with those plans, you're in difficulty. So very successful teachers, very inclusive teachers, are improvisers. They're like jazz musicians. They invent, they think on their feet. That's why teaching is so tiring. People who have never been a teacher can't understand why are they always so tired. They have a short day, they have long holidays, they're surrounded by all these happy, smiling children, and yet they're tired. Now, those of us who've been teachers know why we're tired. It's physically tiring. You're on your feet all the day. It's emotionally tiring. You've got these people draining you. I'm talking about the senior leadership team. That was a joke. And of course, in a way that we don't underestimate, it's intellectually tiring. This business of thinking on your feet, planning in action, it's very demanding. And mostly it's done on your own. So when I ask a teacher to explain how they do it, they can't tell me. So this is a real challenge because if this is about moving knowledge around within a school and people can't explain what they do, then we have a real challenge. Now, the work that my colleagues and I have done then has been very much around that theme. And what we've aimed to do is to find ways in which a language of practice will be developed within a school, not stolen from a book or from a workshop or a conference, but developed socially through learning within the school, a language of practice that allows people to share the detail of the practice, and it is the detail that matters, but also allows the teacher to become more self-aware, more reflective. You've heard the phrase, the reflective practitioner. So the big question for me over the last 2 decades, working with my colleagues, is how can schools create the sort of professional learning within which the language for practice can develop? The investment we've made, and we've had some success, but not always, is to develop forms of inquiry within schools. So my idea of it is of a school which is a kind of research school with a small r, a school where people are collecting with evidence and engaging with evidence. I'll give you some examples in a moment that help them to think about what else they can do. It's about developing professional learning in the school. And when that works, it creates interruptions. In other words, it makes people stop and think. And when it does work, and it doesn't always, it points to overlooked possibilities for moving practice forward. So let me just give you some examples, and most of this is very familiar. This is not some new sophisticated theory that I'm coming up with. It's very practical. It's about making the familiar unfamiliar. You know, the busy teacher, most of the time working on their own, just occasionally has an opportunity to step back with their colleagues and think and talk. It always starts with statistics. Schools generally are good at statistics, obviously some more than others. We count things, attendance, behaviour, progress, and so on. The weakness of statistics, of course, is it tells you what things look like, but it doesn't tell you why. So if you want to intervene, if you want to move practice forward, then you need qualitative evidence. And then we're into familiar ground. A lot of schools that I work with use the idea of a learning walk occasionally. This might be two teachers given half an hour to walk around the school, dipping in and out of classrooms, talking, and as they're doing, reflecting on practice. Sometimes, it can be very effective, it can be two teachers with two children walking around the school and thinking about the school from the perspective of the children. Another way of doing that, of course, is for groups of teachers to sit down with examples of children's work and look at how work is being graded and making comparisons. All of this is creating a professional dialogue within the school workplace. But then some things are particularly powerful in relation to using evidence to stimulate development. Most importantly, I think, is what I've already hinted at, the opportunity for teachers to see one another working. As I said earlier, if teachers do not see one another working, then the school is not getting the benefit of all the expertise that's there. Now, when I say observe one another working, I'm not talking about performance management. I'm all for that. This is seeing one another working voluntarily for professional development. A more sophisticated version of that, which you may be familiar with, is the notion of lesson study. It's a kind of complicated system, social system of professional development based on observation. And there are various examples of it, but if you Google it, you'll get guides and accounts of it. The model that we use in our schools, that are in our projects, is typically we ask teachers to form trios. They agree that they're going to teach one lesson. They plan the lesson together, and then each teacher teaches it with the other two observing, usually keeping an eye particularly on those children who they think are vulnerable in relation to the goals of the lesson. In between each of the lessons, the teachers meet and they change their lesson plan in the light of what they've seen and heard. This is very powerful professional development. It's expensive. Time has to be found. We keep coming back to that. But also the relationships have to be developed. So there's a big implication here for leadership to create relationships which are trusting, where people are prepared to allow one another to be in each other's classrooms. But then the other powerful lever for change, alongside the others, is when the voice of the children is introduced into those discussions. And over the last 10 years, we've worked with schools in 5 European countries where we've actually had children being involved in a kind of lesson study where children themselves are collecting evidence from their classmates and having the opportunity to observe lessons. So All that does is stimulate a professional dialogue within the school. And all of it, as I've said a number of times, has to be coordinated, time has to be found, and the sense of supporting one another has to be created within the workplace. So let's go on to the second set of factors. What happens between schools? Over quite a lot of years, I've worked on quite big projects, including a number of big projects here in the United Kingdom. For example, I led for the government a thing called the Greater Manchester Challenge, which worked with about 1,200 schools. It built on an earlier project, the London Challenge. I worked on a similar project in Wales. I'm currently working on a project in the city of Durham, Dundee in Scotland, where we're working with all schools in the city. And as part of those projects, we've been encouraging schools not only to move knowledge around within their own community, but across the borders of different communities. And I'm convinced that this is adds value to what's going on. Let me give you just one example. I could give you many. This is a school in Manchester. In fact, I could walk to this school from my flat here in about 15 minutes. It's a state school. Um, it's a school that caters for mainly Asian heritage families. Most of the families came from Pakistan. We had a team of advisors as part of the City Challenge programme who worked with schools that were having difficulties. And this school had been identified as having some difficulties. And the advisor, who was a former head teacher, expert, he spent time in the school and he thought that part of the problem the school had was it didn't have a strong system for tracking the progress of children. So he looked for a school elsewhere where there was such a system in place. And he identified a school in another local authority in Bury, those of you who know Greater Manchester, where there was a strong tracking system, another state school. But interestingly, this state school catered for families and children of Jewish Orthodox background. Now, when the suggestion was made by this advisor that the two schools should link together, some of us, including me, I think, were a bit uncertain about this. The idea that a school full of Muslim children would be partnered with a school full of Orthodox Jewish families. Anyway, to cut a long story short, the partnership grew and grew. The tracking system in the Manchester school was improved, but all sorts of other learning occurred. For example, the Jewish school was very strong on the expressive arts. And so the skills of those teachers upon the expressive arts were transferred to the school. They did workshops for the teachers there. The Jewish school also had its own student council, and the Manchester school had never heard of that idea, so they borrowed it from them. A key to these successful partnerships, without question, was the relationship between the head teachers. And where such relationships were not strong, then these partnerships were much more difficult to achieve. Now, having worked now on a lot of these system change projects here in the UK, but also in other parts of the world, including in Australia and in Latin America, I'm convinced that school partnerships of various kinds, it can be two, it can be three. I've worked with quite large families of schools, as we call them, maybe 10 or 12. Where these work, this can add value to the progress of individual school and reduce polarization within a school system. This picture was taken in a network of schools that I've been working with in the last few years. And we created partnerships within this particular network. The partnerships are of three schools, and they call them Learning Threes. And one of the approaches that we've used in that particular network is that within the Learning Threes, schools carry out peer inquiry visits. Now, it's a kind of peer review, but I emphasize the word inquiry. Again, it's based on engaging with evidence. So, in this particular picture, two leaders from the partner schools are spending morning in the host school, observing lessons, talking to teachers, and talking to children. And they're collecting evidence about how the school is working, which at the end of the afternoon, they come together and they talk with the school director of the host school about what they've seen. So another kind of data collection that they use is by scrutinizing examples of children's work, and they look together at how children's work is being graded and so on. I've shadowed quite a few of these partnerships, learning threes, as they called in this particular network. What I, well, it's an amazing learning experience for me to hear three school leaders from different schools coming together, gathering evidence, and then talking about it. It stimulates a lot of professional learning, a lot of professional development. I mean, to give an example, in this particular school, serving again a very poor district, in the meeting at the end of the morning, the head teacher of one of the visiting schools said, I noticed something in your nursery class. In other words, the class where the youngest children are. She said, I noticed that when the children are playing on their own or working with their friends, if there's not an adult there, they don't talk. And she said, as I saw that in your school, it was like a mirror, because I thought that's what happens in my school. And that stimulated a debate amongst themselves about what else they could do to develop oracy within their particular school communities. So I'm absolutely convinced that schools working together has got to be a crucial part of moving the system forward in a more inclusive direction. And clearly, the role of leadership is central to making this happen. So finally, the question of what happens beyond the school gate. This picture was taken a few years back in a public housing estate here in the city of Manchester, and it uses it occasionally to remind me and others of the home backgrounds that some of our children come from, the poverty, economic poverty they come from. But in doing that, I also remind myself to be cautious. It's very easy to jump to conclusions. I've not ever met a family who don't want the best for their children. They may not know how to get the best, and sometimes they may even go about it in an unpleasant way, but they want the best for their family. So the added burden to leadership, it seems to me, as well as focusing on within school factors and beyond school factors, is of course we have to work with the wider community, families, but also other members of the communities that can help what we're doing. And working with my colleagues have done more work on this than I have, to be honest. I've come to the conclusion that if we are to really promote inclusion and equity, if we're to actually open opportunities for children and young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, we'll have to work with community players. We have to link beyond the school gate. And it's difficult. Again, the issue of time is there, but successful schools do that. The example that's often quoted, you're probably familiar with it, that's has sort of stimulated a lot of discussion of this, is what's called the Harlem Children's Zone. It's an area of New York which, over the last 30 years or so, has created a place-wide coordinated effort to ensure that all children get a fair deal. They talk about it being from cradle to career. In other words, as soon as a child is born, there's support available to the child and the family, and it goes right through school until they leave and go to university or go into employment or whatever. They talk about everybody being involved, the family, the school, the police, the local businesses, the university, anybody at all who comes into the life of children. It's been very successful and they got lots of money as a result, and so it's very difficult to replicate. Two of my colleagues, Alan Dyson and Kirsten Kerr, they wrote this guide. If you Google it, you can download it. It was written for England, but the principles they came up with are equally applicable in other parts of the world. And what they were saying in the guide is you can't do the Harlem Children's Zone, but there's certain principles there that you can replicate. And of course, that means taking it out of context. Implicit in everything I've said today is that context matters. What happens in one place might not work in another place. So to sum up, out of all of this, what are the implications for leadership practice? Seems to me those in leadership positions, and it can be many people in a school, have to not just talk about collaboration, they have to demonstrate their commitment to it. Like Madam in that school in Delhi, they have to be actively involved in processes of collaborative professional development. They have to encourage an inquiring stance. In other words, a concern with challenges and questions. I remember some years ago, one of the schools we worked with was a special school. And I visited the school, and the head teacher gave me a cup of coffee. And then she said to me, I want to show you our school development plan. Now, I have to be honest, school development plans don't excite me. They're not the kind of thing I would normally want to read. But anyway, she wanted to show me her plan, which was quite short. And she said, you'll see, there are no targets, there are no priorities, there are just questions. For the next year, our school community will work together to address these questions. The school is becoming an inquiring school, a problem-solving school. Within that, differences come to be seen in new ways. Differences amongst colleagues who may have different views and different opinions, but differences within the children as well. The differences in language, in culture, children who have disabilities, children who have, unusual behaviors. Either they're a problem to be fixed, or they can be a stimulus to innovation. And in schools that make progress, that's what happens. That becomes the what I've called the reflective turn. But of course, the other preoccupation for those in leadership positions is to create the climate where all of this can happen. And of course, what's likely to happen is it's likely to create turbulence. When you try to bring change in a complex organization like a school where everybody's busy, some people are going to get uncomfortable, possibly even distressed, possibly even irritated and annoyed. So the task of leadership is to find ways of creating the climate where, in fact, people who are having periods of difficulty, and it might be quite senior people who are being asked to do things new when they've got used to working in a particular way, where there is the sense of support for those people in relation to their work. And of course, ultimately, it is about practice, it is about organisation, it is about time, but it's about values. And schools that make progress become very articulate about their values. You talk to different people around the school, and they all more or less use the same language to say, this is the kind of school we are. Now, that takes years to create that sense of common purpose, but ultimately, that's what the task of leadership is about. And then, just to finish, really, you may know Edgar Schein is one of the world's gurus of organizational change. And he wrote this years ago, leadership and organizational culture are two sides of the same coin. So the implication of all this, to sum it up, successful leadership is about creating a culture of inclusion and equity where every learner matters and matters equally. But remember, the most important thing, from my experience, is the collective will to make it happen. I welcome your comments and questions or thoughts about all of that. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mel. I think that was a fabulous talk that you've just given. And I've just taken so much notes, and I know I promise to highlight some points, but it's becoming an impossible task, but I will try. Okay. But before we go into that highlight, there are some questions here, Mel,
Okay.
from our participants. For example, Daniel has a question. I mean, Simon, you have posted some comments and thoughts there. So thank you very much for sharing that. And Daniel has a question. How do you handle a class where students are diverse in different ways, especially large classes, and especially classes that has students with multiple learning needs? For example, do we need an IEP for each student?
I mean, that's the $1 million question in a way, which I've not addressed, but in another sense, all of what I've talked about is addressing that. The fact of the matter is, the way the question has been asked, I don't think it can be answered. The question has to be addressed within each school community. Remember what I said, building on the expertise that's there. And then over time, uh, practice develops as people experiment and innovate and support one another, finding ways. But as I said earlier, there'll always be new children, always new children. I remember I worked with in fact, we made a video recording of a school in Manchester, which
Yes.
became very inclusive over 10 years or so. And I remember going around the school one day with the head teacher, and he took me to one classroom and he said, There's a girl in that class who's been excluded because of bad behavior from two other schools. But we watched through the window the lesson, and he said to me, can you identify her? And he said, I said, no, I don't think I can really. And he said, well, that's the interesting thing. He said, what we found is because we have a culture of support, which is there around the school and in the classroom, children adjust to it. Children take account of what's going on around them, particularly what's going on around them amongst the other children. You see, I think the children themselves can be enormous, powerful agents for creating inclusive practices. And I think that the development of forms of practice where children learn together and support one another, cooperative learning, if you will, has got to be an essential part of all of this. But remember what I said, it's a journey. There will always be new children who come along. As far as the idea of IEPs, I'm not a great fan of that, I have to say. And many years ago, before most of you were born, I wrote books about it, and I was very famous for writing individual learning plans. That was the time of that was my time in those days, really. But I think it's a very limiting way. It immediately starts from the focus that the problem is the child, and I think that for me is a cul-de-sac. This is about what I said earlier. This is about school improvement. This is about professional learning. This is about the development of a culture where all children are valued, and where there are children who are presenting difficulties, as of course they will, then the question is, what can we do about it? What are the barriers that those children are experiencing? But it's a difficult move to make, particularly here in England, I have to say, where we have this very competitive education system, and where more and more children are being labelled and categorised, more and more children are being segregated within schools and beyond schools, from schools, and of course, more and more children are dropping out and being excluded. I mean, what we've demonstrated to the point of destruction in England is when you have a competitive education system, you will have winners, and the only way you'll create winners is by creating losers. So what we have to do here in my country, and goodness knows how we're going to do it, we have to bring about a massive change in the philosophy of the education system, including the accountability system. I'm a great believer in accountability. I'm a great believer in inspections. But of course, we tend to inspect the wrong things. And of course, what happens in schools is what gets measured gets done. And what we have to do is to not fall into the trap of measuring valuing what's easy to measure. What we've got to do is we learn how to measure what we value. And that's why the emphasis on presence, participation, and progress can be quite valuable, really. The example that I often use, and I haven't today, probably because of time, one of the places I worked with for over 30 years, as a visitor, of course, is Portugal. Now, Portugal is probably the most inclusive education system in the world. If you Google, I was part of a group that did a review 2 years ago for the OECD on inclusion in Portugal, because there's so much interest in the country. Now, the comparison, it kind of makes me shudder at times, really. But basically, what happened was about 25 years ago, Portugal closed all of its special provision, just closed it. And all the expertise was moved into the mainstream. The special teachers, the speech therapists, the psychologists. All the schools in Portugal work in clusters, local networks. And so the special provision in teams is there in the local cluster. Interestingly, in Portugal, school directors, head teachers, are elected by the local community for 4 years. If they do well, after 4 years, they may be elected for another 4 years, and then they can't go on any longer. So this has created a strong sense of schools working together, but also schools working with the families and the communities. Now, the thing that you hear so much in Portugal, and I heard the minister say it, and I heard teachers saying it, even sometimes parents saying it, what they say is something like, you don't have to label to intervene. So they try to avoid labeling. You can't avoid it completely, but they try to avoid it. The argument is every child matters. So we try to avoid labeling. And of course, excuse me, where help is needed, then they provide it really. So going back to the question, I mean, it's a very important question, but it's very difficult to give a sort of a set answer to. And I think trying to provide a set answer is a cul-de-sac. I mean, now, for example, in this country, there are dozens of books on how to do inclusion. You know, it's like a cookbook. You know, you do the well. I mean, let's not mince words. This is nonsense. How to do inclusion is what I've talked about. It's about the development of school communities. It's about the development of teachers. It's about the involvement of parents, and it involves leadership driven by principles and values. Sorry, that was a long answer.
Thanks, Mel, for that. Mel, there's a request that some of our participants would like to see you. You have your slides displayed here.
Okay, so I take the slides away if I can.
Yeah, so they would like to see you, and as you answer the questions.
There I am.
Um,
Is that better?
yep,
There.
yep.
Okay.
And there is a question by Beth and Wendy here. How do you support school leaders to remove the possible issues of ego from the learning, from the three learning process they provided earlier?
This has
And
come from, sorry, Donny, this has come, we were sort of discussing it whilst you were talking, Mal, because it's actually from our own experience working with some leaders and that kind of hesitation to let other people in and observe, because I guess there's a fear of things being seen that might be wrong. And so
Yeah.
how do you work potentially with leaders that might be a bit hesitant to get involved because of those
And you're thinking particularly of you're thinking of
Yeah.
particular school leaders,
Yeah,
but
so particularly in terms of your learning three model
yes,
process.
yes. Yeah, and I'm sorry to keep repeating myself, but I mean, I often say all of this is technically simple but socially complex. It's quite easy to say in 45 minutes what you need to do, but the complexity of it, as you're saying, is when real people interact in real ways. And I think that's why it can be helpful sometimes to have some kind of an advisor, outsider advisor, maybe academics, who act as a kind of catalyst for this kind of thing. But clearly, partnerships sometimes don't work, do they? And I mean, we have to accept that that's the nature of our world and in our social life and so on. So I think it's about building relationships. And it's quite interesting. I remember I did this big project in Wales for 3 years, and we worked with the 40 secondary schools that were most matters of concern. The newspaper in Wales described them as the naughty 40. And so we worked with these 40 schools, and they also linked with their local primary schools. And I remember, and we did lots of partnership work. And I remember on one occasion I was in one of the secondary schools in August when the examination results were to be announced. All the 16-year-olds take the same examination in the UK. And I chatted with the head teacher before the meeting, and he explained that he'd got the results confidentially the day before. And he said he was very pleased because his schools had done really well. He said, but then I looked at the results of the other, I think there were another 9 or 10 schools in his partnership. He was part of a partnership. We call them families of schools. And he said, I looked at the results of their schools as well, because we had those companies. He said, of course, I wanted us all to do well. I wanted all the schools to do well. That was really nice, you know. And then he said this, but I still wanted to be the best. And I think that's all right. I think it's okay. You know, I think you can mix collaboration and competition. You know, that competition makes you try and pushes you. Collaboration provides resources to support you and other ideas that you can work on and so on. So it is a social process, and it clearly these kind of things go wrong in the way you're talking about. And the best examples that I can tell stories about are all stories of where senior people established good relationships, trusting relationships. I'll make a dangerous generalization now here, which is not totally true. It might get me into trouble. I tend to find women got on with this better than men.
Oops.
What do you think, Wendy, Beth?
I couldn't comment on that. The final comment there.
It's not totally true. It's not totally.
Yeah. And Mel, we have I mean we have very limited time now, so we can only take another two more questions.
Okay.
There's a question by Ronnie here. The discourse is whether if inclusion as a concept also is a way to reduce costs in public schools. Any thoughts on that?
To reduce
Costs,
financial cost.
financial costs in public schools.
I guess it could promote it with that in mind, but I wouldn't want to approve that really, because if anything, we want more resources. And I go back to that picture of that homemade classroom in India. Uh, Resources, buildings, obviously human resources, not everything. It's what you do with them, I think. But clearly, as a citizen, I fight for better resources. I want the schools I visit and associated with them. I want to have the best resources available. And I think if the community wants high quality education for all of its children, which I think by and large people do, then we have to pay for it, I think. So, but I can imagine some people would see it as a way of reducing costs. If you go back to my story of Portugal, for example, they closed their separate provision. Similar thing happened in Italy, by the way, about the same time. But the resources were all reinvested in the mainstream.
Wonderful. Thanks, Mel. And one final question. Simon, you have a question?
Yes, thank you. Just a bit of background context. I'm a second year Ed D student. So I'm just coming towards the end of the talk phase, and I'm going to be researching into neurocognitive inequity within the education workforce. And what I'm thinking at the moment, and if I'd love to know what your thoughts are, is that within the UK system, we do want to be working towards inclusion, and I completely agree. There's got to be an actual action that happens with it, but it is almost entirely focused just on one stakeholder group. And the workforce itself is still being pushed through an integration approach to fixed environments rather than being inclusive, which is what I think is causing why we've got so little disabled staff teachers in education.
Yeah.
And without the disabled staff in those education, there's that lived experience being lost out. And I think that's missing a trick.
Yeah.
So what I'm looking at really is looking at what are those barriers that prevents neurodivergent educators from being able to work in the workplace, so then they can then help benefit the children and young people with their lived experience.
Yes. Yeah.
So what I'm saying is that the system needs to look at inclusion completely in the system. It has to, in order to move it to true values.
I'm sure that's right.
Rather than just focusing on the children and young people. Because I
Yes.
think that if a whole system's inclusive, parents, leadership of neurodiverse workforce, then that's ultimately going to improve things for the children. That's that's my thinking anyway.
Yeah, no, and my version of that, I suppose, to summarize what I've said, is that this is a reform strategy that I'm talking about. It's not about fixing the situation. It's about making reform, and it's got to be wide and therefore inclusive, and it's got to be long term. And I guess what somebody like me can do in a small way, and I don't overstate my role, but it's to show there are examples in my country and other countries of what is possible. Because I think seeing is believing in relation to all of this. And I think all of us on this call, I imagine you're here because you're interested in this. I think we all, in our own way, have something to contribute to all of that. So thank you for all the questions and best of luck. If anyone wants to contact me, you can find my email on the university website. And, I've got things I can send you if you're interested. So thank you, Donnie.
Yeah, thank you, Mel. And just to summarize, Mel, it's brilliant that you started the presentation by immediately highlighting the need for education for all students and for all children. And the picture that you gave of about 260 million students, children, do not have access to education. It's not because they do not want to go to school. They do not have a school to go to. And you talk about barriers about teaching and assessment and all that. And I think one of the highlights that you mentioned is about school improvement needs to start with an attitude, and it needs to start with a belief, and that is a belief in education for all, and it's about bringing people together, having a collective will, making it happen, and bringing the whole collection of people to do something. And it's not just to create an inclusive school, but it starts from an inclusive teaching practices, and you need to invest in that, and that means investing in time, and time is the currency that we use in school. and investing specifically in developing adults, developing people, specifically teacher professionaling, peer learning, and so on. So I guess that in a way conceptualizes or summarizes all that Mel has shared, and there were very specific examples that Mel gives in terms of in school, between schools, and beyond schools factors as well. So thank you very much, Mel. It's been a brilliant talk, and we really appreciate your insights, and thank you for sharing that with us. And I'm sure that all of the other participants are very appreciative of your time as well. Over to Beth and Wendy. You would like to share some updates with regards to the next RIG event that we have?
Yeah, I just want to say from both of us, just Mel, thank you. That was really, really inspiring. And as I said earlier, you've been part of my educational journey since I started my teacher training journey many years ago. And it's just absolutely wonderful to actually hear you actually speak about all the things that you've been doing. So just want to say thank you. Our next research interest group RIG event will be on the 19th of June, and we will be joined by the wonderful Professor Dan Goodley from the University of Sheffield for this one, and he will be discussing his research around the university or higher education relationship with disabilities. That's the 19th of June, and with Professor Dan Goodley. Okay, so that's a really sort of exciting follow-up to this event as well. So yeah, looking forward to that one.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. Beth, you have anything to add, Beth?
One of the key things for me is what Mel has been talking about is echoing conversations that we've been having, and we were sort of like, oh, we've just been talking about this, and we've just been talking, and so for us, developing our understanding, particularly through the models that you've presented, and the language that you use around inclusion and how this can manifest in schools, it's been genuinely really useful for us in terms of our journey, not just in the RIG, but in our professional practice as well. So thank you so much. It's been really enlightening.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Beth. And also just to share with all our members here today, this is a little bit background about BELMAS. So our research interest group is part of the Inclusion Research Interest Group is part of BELMAS. Let me just swap this slide over so it's much clearer. So we are part of BELMAS, the British Educational Leadership Management and Administration Society. There's lots of backgrounds about BELMAS and what are the activities. And you can see that its memberships is spanning across 75 countries. And there's lots of benefits to be a member of BELMAS. And much of this information comes and also highlights from in the website. And you could see that one of the benefits is what we are doing now, participation in the research interest groups and having esteemed and well, knowledgeable and experienced speakers like Mel coming on board and Dan coming aboard in June, sharing with us some of their experiences and most importantly, some of the research and that they have come across and what we can learn from those. And to be a member for BELMAS, there are different categories. So if you come across as a student, then you have a student price there. Early career researcher is almost the same price. It's just that if you come across an individual, then you have that £60 membership fee. So this is a membership fee per annum, per year. And there are other RIGs as well. And Inclusion Leadership RIG is one of them, but there are also plenty of other RIGs. So if you were to sign up for BELMAS, you're not limited to just one RIG. You have an opportunity to join the other RIGs as well. And all this information is also available in the BELMAS website. So we hope to see you again in future events. I've noted some comments. For example, some of the participants would like some time maybe to have like a 5 minutes of introduction so that we get to know each other's background. This is something that we will discuss very closely, myself, Beth, and Wendy. This is our first event, but of course there are always other rooms for improvement and other ways in which that we can make it a little bit more interesting.
Sorry, Donnie, sorry to add to what you're saying there. going to be at the Belmas conference in July, and that will provide an opportunity. Our event for our rig will be advertised close to the time, but as part of that, we're hoping that people can come online, if they're not in person, to be able to talk through their research interests, because we want to really build this community. So sorry to talk there, Donnie. I just thought it was important.
No, not at all, Beth, and thanks so much, everyone. I think we before we go and we close today, we need to do something very, very important. We need to capture this wonderful memory we have today. So can we take a nice photograph, especially with Mel as he gets more and more busier? So let's capture. We have Mel today and ensure that we have him in a nice frame. So can you please turn on your camera if you can? And I will help to take on a nice picture, and that will frame as our first research interest group event for the year. Okay, so nice smiles right there. Daniel, would you like to join us, Daniel? Are you there, Daniel? No, I'm not gonna force you, but just in case you're there. All right, so big smiles and a thumbs up to Mel. Okay, well, 1 and a 2 and a 3. Wonderful. So I've captured that. And thank you, everyone. And thank you for joining us. We hope to see you again.
Another one. I missed that one.
Daniel was getting his cup of tea.
And I thought Daniel just wants to make himself look extra good. So it's like, nah, I'm not going to miss this. I'm going to look extra good. Yeah. All right. So let's do
Thank
another
you.
one. A thumbs up. And I noticed Ryan has now have 2 thumbs up. Yep. So 1 and a 2 and a 3. Okay,
Thank you.
so thank you, everyone. See you again in June for the next talk with Dan. We have the LinkedIn website. We have the Twitter. You can follow us and just email Belmas office if you need that info. And we hope to see you at the Belmas conference as well, either in person or even online for that special session we have for our research interest group. So have a good evening, good day, good afternoon, good morning. Good
Bye
weekend.
all.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye all.
Bye.